And lovely. So welcome everyone once again. I hope you had a fantastic partner kickoff for those of you based in EMEA and APAC. And for these folks based in AMER, I hope you're enjoying the PKO 2022. And thank you very much for joining us today in this special session of the meetups, the PKO meetup. As we're getting wiser as well, in the top right, you can see this is session number 65 from the online English group started by Manik and Royston Lobo. So now we're going to do very quickly 5 minutes announcements, introductions on the rules, and then I will open up the stage for our great speaker for today, which is Steve Clarke from Slalom. He will be guiding us on the C4E, driving value into your API delivery. Now, with that said, very quickly, the organizers of this meetup, you can have Manik and Sandeep in Americas. You have Royston Lobo leading APAC from the Singapore headquarters, and you have myself, Alberici, based in London. If we move on to this next slide, remember that the training, you can find any information about training, training.mulesoft.com. There is the additional training queries URL there for anything around certifications, any issues you're having, you can submit it to that URL. And then you have your common two places, Stack Overflow and the help.mulesoft.com. Very important guidelines for today. Please pop your questions in the chat and anyone in the community can try to answer. The questions that remain pending will be asked in your behalf through the session, actually, and at the end. Now, the recording, before you ask, is going to be shared in the Meetups page and also in the VirtualMuleys YouTube channel, has always been. So don't worry about that. Both slides will be showing there in the Meetups page and the recording as well. Now, with that out of the way, we have the announcements and updates. What is new? What is happening? The MuleSoft Certified Developer Level 2. For all of those that want to get the certification, you already have the MCD Level 1, and now you will be able to compete for the MCD Level 2 that is based on 2 courses that are Level 2 courses, MuleSoft courses, Production Ready Development Practices and Production Ready Integrations course. These 2 courses are going to be the base for this certification. It's exciting news from the training team. The certification will be available through April. Now, a new benchmark report from the MuleSoft organization that was submitted for 2022 is now available. You can find it there in the link. It has some important information relevant to developers, to architects, for consultants, that talks a bit about what are the interests of companies in the technologies for integration, what are the interest appetites for APIs, how is that changing in the market. For example, API monetization is starting to be a big topic nowadays. After that, we also have a couple of updates. These are a mix between Catalyst, your knowledge hub of all that has always been, and a couple of new assets. So you can see there, one related to Accelerate Mule. That's when you're working with B2B. There's a second one on Metrics Toolkit. It's a new webinar that was released recently. There is one documentation related to new Mule development standards that you can use for your Mule APIs. And on the right, you can see CPU Utilization Toolkit. Very useful. It's from the services team, actually. And then you have 2 other assets, one for publishing JSON loggers on Anypoint Exchange with the SAML SSO, and the other one around C4E metrics. Last 2 things, we have the customer-facing self-help resources. This is important for anyone that is joining for the first time. This is how you can get yourself around MuleSoft. There's documentation, help articles, help forums, Stack Overflow. There is YouTube videos, Friends of Max, training videos. So how you can get on top of all these resources, blogs, developer portals, you can watch this 10 minutes video and you will be able to understand where to look for what. I know this slide has been appearing a couple of times, but I'm still experiencing some issues in some customers. I want to make sure that everyone is aware of the MuleSoft recommended support process. This support article has the details on how you troubleshoot the most basic and most common incidents you can find. Now, Tim, I already did the 5 minutes, and with that, I'm going to finally stop sharing the screen, and we're going to open up the stage for our great speaker for today, Steve Clarke. Welcome. Thank you for joining the community and for doing excellent. I know that it's going to be an excellent session, Steve.
Thanks, Angel. Appreciate the introduction, and welcome everybody to our session today. Hope you all had a great PKO introduction so far. If you're in EMEA and if you're elsewhere and you're joining a different session, you're going to get a lot of value out of it. So today I was going to talk about driving value into your API delivery through C4E and Platform Metrics. And this is an interesting topic because we talk about C4E a lot in MuleSoft project delivery. And interestingly, what comes up in conversation a lot, which I thought would make a great topic for conversation here, was how do you bring platform metrics into that process to create an evolutionary style of improvement around your C4E. So I'm Steve Clarke. I'm the practice director for the MuleSoft practice in Slalom in the UK and EMEA. I have responsibilities for project delivery with Slalom here. And I want to explain a little bit about what our session today is going to cover. So basically, I split it into 3 parts, just to break it up a little bit. I'm going to talk a little bit about what a pragmatic C4E looks like, and I'll cover what a C4E in terms of a quick refresh about what it's about and the core capabilities that you'd look for at launch. But interestingly, for beyond your MVP, if we think of your C4E as a minimum viable product, what do you look for when you set it up? And then what should you think about for the longer term that's going to make it more successful? And a few practical tips around that we've learned in Slalom that adds a lot of value. I'll then move on to talking about metrics insight and how you can plan some of the metrics and insights into your MuleSoft platform, and particularly your C4E, that you can start to monitor and measure over time that will make your C4E a capability enabler for your organization. And lastly, I'm going to just bring that together through some examples of how you can use those insights to drive value into your C4E. And there's so many examples to draw from, but I've picked a half dozen examples that I think you'll find really valuable. And we'll try and stop for questions at the end of each one of these. So I welcome, a couple of questions at each point, and then hopefully we'll have plenty of time at the end for more questions as well. But feel free to drop them in the chat, and we're happy to answer them either now or later on. So a little bit about myself. I'm obviously Australian originally, but I've been in the UK for quite a long time in EMEA. I've been working for roughly 25 years, and I've worked globally across Asia Pac, EMEA, Africa, America, and lots of other places, which are probably more talked about over a beer. I've been working in integration for about 22 years now across most of the major integration stacks that I think all of you would have come across. And I've come into the MuleSoft arena purely by accident when I was at a client some years ago, and been in love with it ever since, and developed lots of great projects along the way. And that's taken me on a great journey, including MuleSoft champion and mentor roles, which I highly recommend to people. And I really enjoy working with the technology, but I also enjoy working with C-suite executives and taking that through to delivery in our projects and getting very heavily involved in those. So great journey so far, and happy to share my experience with everybody as well. So a little bit about Slalom. So Slalom is a modern consulting firm focused on strategy and technology and business transformation. We're very practical, pragmatic in terms of consulting, and we really look to help pivot to where the client is in terms of solving problems. And that's great from a MuleSoft point of view, because we were able to articulate the value of MuleSoft in a very pragmatic way that helps achieve real business outcomes, and in line with the vision that MuleSoft have set out. One of our key challenges, and therefore one of our benefits and advantages, is that we're global. We're not everywhere yet, but we're growing quite fast, and we're really proud to be the #3 Salesforce partner in America and #4 globally. And our MuleSoft partnership status is on par with that. So we have probably close to 10,000 consultants now. So we've grown quite quickly, and we continue to grow rapidly through lots of interesting projects and expansion into Europe as well. We have a great Salesforce ecosystem as well, of which MuleSoft is a part. And one of our advantages in EMEA is that we're one of the few MuleSoft and Salesforce partners that actually can bring those capabilities to clients in a very unified way and derive the value of MuleSoft from that. Happy to talk on any of these things for anyone who's interested in looking at those as well. And we are very focused on MuleSoft. So I lead the MuleSoft practice, as I mentioned. We have a really great success story with a large number of projects, both in EMEA and globally. And we have really core capabilities too that pivot very strongly to the MuleSoft advantages, particularly around the full life cycle of capability. And there's just a few of them that I mentioned here as the key ones. And the areas we're going to focus on today are evolving around helping you getting MuleSoft delivered, but also developing that insight and optimization to make it even better. So a little bit about how to build a pragmatic C4E. Well, what is a C4E? As we know, a C4E is a center for enablement that plays a key role in evolving and helping guide the governing and evolution of your API landscape using MuleSoft. But more importantly, it comprises the people and the processes and the technology enablers that make that possible. And what we recommend that is focused on in a pragmatic C4E is tools and best practices and templates and methodologies that you establish, which are really important to have those set out and have them very mature, but also having the ability to continuously improve on the quality of that. So measuring around that and feeding that back into your delivery. And these things feed into your agility and time to market for your organization. And finally, one of the really important things that we've learned is having the right mindset in terms of how you take your API journey forward and how you evangelize that is really critical to winning the hearts and minds, and not just your IT team that are delivering MuleSoft and other systems, but also the business stakeholders that are the customers and consumers of those products. So a good C4E, in our view, is helping take all of those stakeholders on that journey and making that a continuous process. And that's roughly what we're going to talk about today. So as I mentioned, a C4E can offer real value, but only if you can really measure that value. And quite often you find people talking about things like centers of excellence and centers for enablement. But what's really important when you talk about these things with customers is how can you help them understand the best ways of measuring that value, and having those measures in place, but not having any tangible way of feeding those back in to your C4E doesn't really produce the outcomes that you would ultimately be looking for. But these things do take time, but it's important to try and set them out early when you start your C4E journey. So what's really the end game that you're trying to achieve here in a C4E? Well, in a nutshell, it's about trying to move towards a virtuous cycle of delivery, as opposed to a vicious cycle of delivery. So in a vicious cycle of delivery, no goals, no objectives, bad behaviors, poor quality measurements, and those things often leads to bad results, and that can just continue around endlessly. But in a good model, having objectives and things to measure and actions that help you achieve that create a virtuous circle of delivery that ultimately is self-sustaining for your C4E and ultimately your API delivery as well. So what we're trying to do is ultimately pivot towards a virtuous circle of delivery that will allow your C4E to help grow your capability and accelerate that to market. Went too far then. So when you're launching your C4E, you nearly need to think about it as a minimum viable product. Winning the hearts and minds of stakeholders is really important. And so you want to start out in terms of what it is that you need to achieve with that. And we're talking about things like having a clear vision and a mission that for that C4E, what is it trying to do to deliver MuleSoft in your organization? And what does good look like? And setting out that roadmap for delivery. And you want to create a foundational team around that of strong people. Sometimes you want new people coming in that are learning MuleSoft, and you have to pair them up with experienced people so they learn the best ways of delivering MuleSoft and APIs in that business. But you also want to do, as part of your MVP, your foundational standards, baselines, and ways of working. And that includes setting things up like your governance artifacts, like your catalog, a registry for APIs that you're going to use for design, non-functional requirements and templates, and all of those things. And really what you want to do in your MVP is try and have the right team structure, but also use your initial sprints to help validate that structure, validate the frameworks and standards and other things that you're starting to step out with. And then you can iterate that structure out. So on the right here, we can see an example model of where you might start with a common concept that's referred to as like an API factory, which is very centralized. You've got a fairly close-knit team, and you're trying to get the ways of working and the standards and things in place. And then you want to start to iterate them out to a more proper C4E model, which would look something like this. So beyond your minimum viable product, you're then starting to think about, what does my core C4E now need to look like? And what do my lines of business then need as capabilities in their team in terms of roles and responsibilities? And how do those things work together then over time? And ultimately, you end up with this type of model where your core team helps enable your lines of business and your spokes, if I can use that word, but also the learnings of those teams form a community of practice that comes back into the C4E and helps help grow and evolve it. And metrics can play a key part in helping drive the quality outcomes in this area. So ultimately, you want to establish your vision and charter up front. In our experience, not all C4Es are alike. So you can establish a C4E as a boilerplate model, but ultimately, each customer will have a different organizational construct of what can look like on day one and what they think it will need to look like in the future based on their capabilities, their organizational structure, the way they work in that organization, whether they're truly agile or waterfall or somewhere in between. And I think we've all found that these types of experiences influence how effective the C4E can be. So what we want to do is have a clear view or clear vision and charter of what the C4E will need to look like. And it really revolves around these core areas where you're heading for this target state, where you can help define what APIs need to be built out and help govern and guide those, but also play a coaching role and a maintenance role around the platform as well, so that the platform evolves in the right way, but also the organization can develop speed of delivery at the pace that those different parts of the business need to assume. So you want to make sure that you can have a very good balance between that. So in this model, you can see the C4E is influencing all of those things, but different parts of the business will play a role in owning some of that or not, depending on how mature they are in that process and how they've learned MuleSoft. And so you want to have a target state to move towards, but you also have to have a balance, as I said. So what could a typical roadmap look like in your C4E as you go from MVP to end state? It might look something like this. And initially, when you do your Catalyst launch, really what you're trying to do is get up and running, establish your initial MuleSoft, engage project work. There'll be very limited platform knowledge around, and you're trying to develop that, and there'll be limited resources. You're getting up and running and just trying to get people, invested in the platform and on their way. And then you'll move progressively to this centralized model, ways of working, principles, patterns, standards, validate them and get them set up. And this is not a definitive list of all of those by any means, but it's certainly a few that come to mind. But your goal at the end is to try and move towards a full-fledged C4E model where you have that spoke capability and the C4E is becoming a true enabler. And the time it takes to get to that kind of end state, if you like, it can vary by organization. A typical rule of thumb in my experience is ideally you want to get there in 6 months, at the very worst 12 months, depending on the pace of the organization. And your roadmap should reflect where you bring in some of these capabilities on that journey, because it's very, very hard to bring them one It's very hard to get the adoption. And so you want to come up with a roadmap that has the right pace of delivery. One of the key things is really important, I think, to try and do when you set up your C4E is take people on the journey and explain the API lifecycle in clear terms and where do the different parts of MuleSoft fulfill that lifecycle. And this is an example of a model that you could present which shows going on that journey from when you identify integrations and what and elsewhere play a role there, like your integration catalog, right through to how you prototype and validate design, right through to build unit testing and so on, including around to analytics, which is part of the topic of today's presentation. And this is really important when you're setting out a C4E, in that the C4E plays a role in helping cultivate and facilitate these capabilities in the organization. And so it's really important that you take not only the C4E members on this journey, but also business stakeholders and other stakeholders as well, so that they understand where they can dive into parts of the life cycle and understand what's happening, where they can discover assets, how they can play more of a role as a participator rather than an observer, and start to take ownership of some of these areas from a product point of view. And going on this, taking them on this journey is helping evangelize the platform and the C4E process. So it's a really important aspect of C4E to come up with a way of evangelizing that. And this is just one example of how you can do that. So I'd really recommend it if you're starting out your C4E, is to think of a model that works best for your particular organization. Equally, governance artifacts are really important, I think, in a C4E. One of the things that is have some way at the outset of managing scope and managing deliverables. You know, what integrations are you going to build and where are they at in their life cycle? Not everything will sit in Exchange on day one. You have to start from somewhere. So you do need to have an integration catalog or something like that that sets out the scope for your C4E and ultimately the scope of all integrations. And ultimately you want to make that a shared asset. So you'll want to come up with a way to publish that and make that consumable by different organizations and different stakeholders in your organization, so that they can start to own the assets that belong to them during the early parts of the life cycle, but also when they're mature products. So having an integration catalog on what I call a mud map, which is a visual version of your catalog showing where everything points to, are really good artifacts to have in place. And equally, you can have something like an API registry, which is taking your end-to-end integrations and breaking them down into the specific API endpoints that you might want to start to model out. And this is a really important thing if you're trying to do something like domain-driven design in MuleSoft and you're trying to get alignment across assets to make them reusable. So these are really good artifacts from a governance point of view to help guide stakeholders from a C4E perspective on how to do these things in a mature and constructive way. The other thing that's really important in a C4E, I think, is, as I mentioned before, is winning the hearts and minds of stakeholders to understand the API-led approach to delivery. And that is to take them on the journey of what is the difference between an integration and an API and how to then measure that in terms of reusability and other things. And a good way of doing that is something like this, where you'll have end-to-end integrations like int001 or int002, for example. And when you're trying to get people to understand, well, why do we build the layers and why do we have reusability, coming up with a model that helps them understand where that reusability starts to pay for itself is a really good way from a C4E point of view to start to win hearts and minds. And this can form the foundation of some of the content that you publish in the C4E when you get new project stakeholders coming on board to the MuleSoft platform, so that they understand how the platform can help drive delivery and reusability. So it's a really good recommendation when you set out your C4E is to come up with creative ways of explaining concepts like reusability and other patterns in a way that helps non-integration stakeholders come on board. And it's all about evangelizing the platform. So a C4E plays a role, I think, in helping do that evangelism, not just for existing projects, but for new customers, or why would we use MuleSoft for our project? Well, this helps answer the why and helps answer the benefits in a very visual way. So I highly recommend coming up with visual ways of doing that, because then it helps with the measurability of that later on. The other aspect that's a really good idea is to give structure to your C4E delivery is try and align your design and build deliverables to things like definition of ready, definition of done around the API lifecycle. And everyone will have a different interpretation probably of what these things are and what comprises definition of ready, definition of done. So these are just some examples of what that might look like. And really you were tying it to the parts of the lifecycle that I mentioned earlier. So for example, before you start doing an API design, you really want to have clear user stories and you want to have clear data requirements and all those obvious things. But when you get into definition of done, you can be more MuleSoft specific. You have clear RAML, you have your API catalog modeled out, you have a mock, all these things. You can use that to give structure to your C4E. And then as you span the C4E capability out as spokes into your organization, structure creates predictability, which creates accelerated delivery. Without some structure around templates and ways of working like this, you run the risk of different parts of the organization doing things slightly differently, and that becomes harder to then govern and manage over time. So one of your foundational pieces of C4E should be to try and create that predictability and that structure up front. And doing things like this is a great way of trying to do that. And it will be different for every organization ultimately. So what might that look like in practice? Well, a good example would be, you're creating templates and accelerators, as I mentioned on the left here, MuleSoft templates, getting started guides, configuration guides, tips and tricks. But you can take that structured approach and bake that into your agile delivery model. So you can create templated stories which are aligned to definition of ready, definition of done. And then as you spin up new projects, you literally can accelerate the stand-up of those projects by cloning those capabilities into those project backlogs, in effect. So part of your C4E should be to try and create some structure and predictability so that things happen consistently and are therefore more measurable using metrics. So I'll just pause there and just see if we have any initial questions, Angel, that we might want to answer on that particular stage.
Yeah, so far we have one question from Sebastian that is related to, does it make sense to start C4E at the very beginning when we're working with our first API implementation, when we have the test use case? Actually, we are in fact working with the test use case still. So the question is, does it make sense? Okay, good.
Great question. Yeah, not always. I think if you're evaluating the platform and you're certainly looking to evaluate how you're going to do things on the platform, no, it doesn't make sense necessarily to set up your C4E at that point in time. But hopefully it will, evaluating that first API will some of the things that are important to your C4E and how to set that up. So you probably saw from the that stage journey that I showed, in the first stage there was very little happening in terms of C4E capabilities because you're just getting started. So you're thinking through how that C4E model might work. I've seen customers, for example, who think they have to set up their C4E all up front before they start any projects. I certainly don't recommend that approach. I think you need to get started on understanding the platform a little bit and learning how to use it, and then learning how to use it very well, what good practice looks like. So yeah, that would be my recommendation, is to get started and then start thinking about it and do those in parallel, and you'll be more successful there.
It almost sounds... Yeah, we have another question, and there is a point there that it sounds very relatable to the having the quick win project, right? First, we want to make a project that is a scope, that is important, that is relevant, that we can actually achieve, and then we can start defining around it in parallel.
So whose question was that? Was that Sebastian? No, it wasn't Sebastian.
No, I was just adding to the answer. And the second question that we have is from Miguel Pereira. And the question is there a minimum architecture size in terms of API number to consider as C4E?
Really good question, Miguel. No, there's no minimum architecture size. I think it's down to, in my experience, how big the organization is and how many APIs ultimately you will build out over time. I would probably say once you start getting to a size of about 15 to 20 APIs and you're starting to get a lot of consumers using them and then a lot of new projects coming on board to the platform. So you've got a lot of stakeholders to care about as your customers, if I can use that word. That would be the point at which I'd start thinking about a full-fledged C4E. But again, full-fledged, it can be whatever you think it is for that organization. So there's no minimum number of APIs. It's down to what minimum capabilities and standards and other practices you think are best to help manage what you're building out. So I would recommend considering that in the context of what you're doing on your organization.
Thank you for that.
We'll do one more question.
Yeah, the next question is from Ruchika. Is in a C4E model, who owns the responsibility of managing and governance around shared APIs? For example, system APIs shared among different lines of business.
Great question. In my experience, that tended to be owned by C4E. So if you have assets that are considered to be corporate assets or common assets, there's typically a decision that needs to be made that it's a centralized capability that will help guide and own those and bring those stakeholders together when there's changes that are needed or other things. But often as well, you can see that if it's designed well, each API should ultimately align to a particular product owner. And that product owner should be the person that takes the lead to bring other product owners in who might be co-owners, if you like. But if it's a utility type API or something that's a fairly common API, it might be C4E that ultimately takes the ownership of that, unless in the absence of anybody else. So yeah, that's a good question. We'll do this last question from C2. How frequently does a C4E meet? Yeah, there's no hard and fast rule on that. In my experience, most good C4Es or communities of practice, which is what it should turn into, should connect up weekly if you've got a massive amount of project work going on. I would probably say no less than every 2 weeks if you've got project activity going on your platform. Again, it's down to what the organization is doing at the time, but in many large clients that I've worked at, where they have upwards of 100 APIs across multiple parts of the business, the C4E is normally meeting every week to just guide and govern and help steer direction across new capabilities or changes to existing capabilities. Cool. Those are really great questions. Thank you. So just on to the next part of it. So developing metrics insight. So really, what are we trying to do? What are the benefits of what we're trying to do in terms of measuring insight into our platform and particular KPIs? So really what we're trying to do is we're trying to do things like measure the operational effectiveness of the MuleSoft platform. How well is it being used? What type of insights can we get, and what types of challenges are we seeing that we need to help improve on? But also, how much is it being used and what value are we getting from that? So there's a lot of data you can get out of the MuleSoft platform, and you can provision that into a set of configurable dashboards, which give individual stakeholders insight into what's happening on their products or their APIs, but also more centrally across different capabilities and how it's being used. And this can provide really useful information about what APIs are valuable, what you can do, where they're not being used and why, and other insights into operational effectiveness. And really what you're trying to do is end up in a benefit of having it very configurable so that as new APIs come into your ecosystem, it becomes a case of configuring insights into those APIs rather than having to build things to find that insight. So you're building a framework ultimately that is scalable and flexible over time, and it gives the insight for the product owners that you have. The ultimate end game is to try and get a single pane of glass that gives you insight into all the things that you care about. So what do you care about? Well, I guess the high order bit in terms of what you care about is what KPIs are you trying to measure? From where are you trying to measure that information? Because it may not just be MuleSoft, and I'll explain why in a minute, and why you're trying to measure those things. And here's a few examples of what you can measure in terms of C4E KPIs. A lot of these we would probably recognize because we deal with them in projects week in, week out. But these are some of the MuleSoft platform KPIs that you can certainly measure, from the number of APIs that you've got being used to vCore utilization around your license, so you know when you're hitting certain limits, but also other things like how well are the assets being discovered, how much are they being reused, so are you getting that return on investment, how many people are using the platform even. These are really good insights to ultimately obtain. But really what you want to do before you start trying to measure metrics is really being clear about what you want to measure and what outcome are you trying to measure ultimately for the business. And it can be operational insights, but it can also be business insights. And one of the lessons I've learned over doing this exercise with many clients is they're not clear about what they want to measure and why they want to do it. And so we go around that process a few times to make sure that's really clear, so that they are getting that value at the end and they're baking that in early as they build out their API ecosystem. So what information might we capture from a MuleSoft point of view? Well, loads. Excuse me. So we can certainly measure things like how often we have a policy violation, or how often we get certain types of response codes in our APIs, and what kind of impact that's having. For example, retries and timeouts and other things. Gives us insight into how reliable some of our APIs and different systems are. But we're also into some of the runtime metrics, such as CPU usage, deployment failures, worker scalability, and other things. They can be very important depending on the types of APIs we have. But also things around governance, are tagging and domains and categories being assigned? Does Exchange content get published when an API is initially developed? Making sure that entire life cycle that I showed earlier, making sure that we are hitting our KPIs that we've identified around each of those areas. And we can surface those into different places, as I mentioned. So in this example, we've got it in Elastic Stack, but you can certainly surface it in other ways. And so there's different tooling options that you can ultimately adopt for this. So I'm not going to take you through how to do that specifically. Excuse me. But here's a couple of examples of what you can do, such as endpoint monitoring, which has lots of capabilities in it, but it is limited to what's just in MuleSoft. But there's also the metrics accelerator, which if you're not aware of that, I definitely recommend you have a look at that, because it provides a great way to extend the reach of MuleSoft into other monitoring environments that customers might already be using. And it helps you achieve that single pane of glass outcome, which is what you're ultimately looking for. So what should you consider when you design the target of your metric solution that you're really trying to measure? Well, really consider your data sources. So as we mentioned before, what are you trying to measure and where do you think you're going to get that data from? So you might have sources like MuleSoft, obviously. You're trying to measure reuse in MuleSoft and effectiveness in MuleSoft. But you might also have incident management in ServiceNow, and you want to tie that data in. So customers are using APIs, or they've got production business processes that are consuming MuleSoft APIs, and there's tickets being raised off the back of those issues, and you can tie them into your MuleSoft ecosystem. Development lifecycle tickets such as in Jira, you can tie all this information together. So how do they relate to each other? And when you have these different data sources and you bring them together, it's really important to make sure that data can be correlated, which is really easy to do in MuleSoft, but in Metrics Accelerator, but also in the target stack that you're pushing this data into. But you want to make sure it's configurable. You want to make sure that you can add new data sources in over time, depending on the relevance of that source, and make sure that that data maps into your single pane of glass at the end of the day. But the other thing to consider as well is thinking about reliability and where the data sits globally and locally and how that ties together. Because when you get it into your metric solution, you want to be able to drill up and down into that data and filter it based on the relevancy of that data to the stakeholder that's looking at it. And if you model that well, you can derive a rich amount of KPIs out of a very minimal amount of data through something like Metrics Accelerator. So you want to get the most value at the end of the day without having to do tons of work to do it. So it does require some thinking about the target solution that you're building out. So some of the delivery challenges you may have is how you map some of the KPIs to the data sources that you're getting them from. So you need to think about what that data is, how it's structured. Is it in the right structure for you to surface your KPIs? Do you need to do any transformation to get it into that structure? You should think about an MVP around core searchable data. So what do you want to search on initially? And then how do you want to extend that? You do need to develop some knowledge around your target stack. So if Splunk is your target metric solution, definitely understand what it can do and what it can't do. And how do you then get the data into it and make it reliable and scalable so that if it fails, you can start again and repopulate. But also think about the data structures, because often you're pulling data from multiple sources, and some of those sources are easily digestible into things like Splunk and Elasticsearch. And then in other cases, you've got to do a lot of massaging of that data to get it there. So these are all key decisions to get to the right outcome, and you do need to think through some of these before you start. This is an example of what a metrics accelerator solution would look like, and there's one that we produced previously where we had platform APIs from MuleSoft. We were pulling data out. We were pushing that data into Elastic Stack, but we were also pulling data from other sources like Jira for development tickets and testing tickets and other things, so we could see how the quality of the testing around different APIs. But we also pulled data from ServiceNow for things that were in production. And we were pushing incidents to ServiceNow from our MuleSoft APIs as a utility API call as part of our logging framework, so that when those APIs went into production, incidents would automatically get generated for certain types of faults. And we fed that back into our API metrics, which was really, really good. So this is what a potential architecture could look like. And you can take Metrics Accelerator and extend it to support an architecture like this. But you do need to think about the data sources, as I mentioned. It's really important. So I'll just stop there again for any questions that we might have around how you build out your Metrics Accelerator. Certainly, it's not meant to be a tutorial on how to do that, but I'm happy to talk to people about it offline as well. So we've got a question here from David. Why would a data lake be toxic? No, it's not a toxic data lake. The simple answer to that question is it was an example model of why you want to think about your architecture so that you don't end up in a bad architectural state. So it's about making sure your data is valuable, not toxic. This is really the analogy I was going for there. But yeah, good question. We've got a question here on, is this accelerator already available on Exchange? Yes, I believe it is available on the MuleSoft forums if you want to go and look for it there, but I have included a link there as well in the slides, which you can also grab. It does go through routine iterations. It is in open source, so you can take it and develop it further if you want to. Any other questions on that particular part?
We did have another question from C2, is if you can share some KPIs that are not automated.
That are not health related?
They are not automated. I'm not sure what C2 is referring to as in automated. I'm not sure if it's part of the out of the box from the Metrics Accelerator toolkit, or if it's some other.
I can talk about that in the next section. We've got a few examples that probably touch on that as well. Yeah, I mean, automated KPIs are really, you're not so much, you're trying to measure different outcomes. And I think what you find, if you get the right data set into your analytics solution, you should be able to create different KPIs from that you can measure that are derivable from that source data. So not everything has to derive from a particular event or particular activity. So an example I just showed where we had, say, incidents being generated to ServiceNow, some of the KPIs that I'll show in the next section that we ultimately measured were things that we started to care about around the quality of the ecosystem that weren't being automated. We were just bringing the data together in different ways to try and form a view on that. And we were looking for gaps in our delivery model and gaps in our DevOps to improve those things and create that virtuous circle. So these weren't things that were automated. These were just things we were trying to get insight into because the data was there. And then it's all about trying to identify that data. So, you know, ultimately you can automate a lot, but there are some things that you can't. It is very hard, for example, to automate a lot of KPIs around licensing. There's only so much you can do around that. You need additional data to make certain decisions. You can't, for example, cost consumption is something that is often hard to do in terms of measuring unless you've got some data somewhere that has a cost metric against it. So that's something that you have to then extend into your model. But these are all things to do, but sometimes they're not worth the investment of time. Cool. So just onto the final part then of bringing this together through examples. So I find the best way to kind of give insight into what is the real value around some of these things is to really showcase what ultimately you can get out of it. And these are just some examples of what you can do with it. So one example is, you know, measuring usage of the platform. So what are we trying to measure? We're trying to measure how much it's used and what consumption there is on it and structure and other things that are fairly foundational to the platform itself. So these are things like how many reusable assets have we got on Exchange, how many APIs are being used more than once or above a certain metric of reuse, depending on what you think reuse is. Some people say it's used at least twice. Other organizations say in order to say it's of reusable value, it has to be at least 3 times, 3 consumer applications. So you can set those metrics and then start to measure against them and dashboard around those types of capabilities. So you can develop dashboards around your core data from the MuleSoft platform using Metrics Accelerator. But why do you do this? Well, ultimately you want to understand the usage of your platform, where it's high, where the C4E might help to focus on that, and also to monitor asset growth over time. So is your platform growing? Is your ecosystem growing versus you're reusing more of your assets? And higher reuse indicates really good design, whereas higher proliferation across different similar data models probably indicates some design challenges that you're not getting people to focus on using the assets that are there. Either they're not consumable enough or people aren't aware that they should, how to discover them. So these types of insights can help you dive into that and form a view of how best to, you know, educate and inform some of the stakeholders in your organization. But it also comes down to who your customers are, and your customers are not just IT stakeholders, but also business stakeholders. So your dashboards can give them different insights and different points of view of what they need to care about around environments, APIs, and also who's using the platform in their organization. And these are just a couple of examples of doing that. So diving into the detail, you can see that you've got what Exchange assets were created when, but also you can break them down by type if you've done your tagging and categorization really well. So you can break them down by type and also identify where the reusability is coming into those different layers. And you can measure things like average reuse, for example. And in this example, it's quite low, but it's better than 1. So this is very early in a particular engagement, and we were looking to move that number up, obviously. So again, usage by organization and what are the top used APIs. These are some other metrics that you can also measure. So if you've modeled your business well and you tagged your APIs really well in Exchange, which is something that you can enforce through policies, it'll give you some insight into who's using what APIs and to what percentage and so on. And you can get an insight into how reusable your overall ecosystem is becoming. A low reuse, as I mentioned, can give an insight, for example, into how discoverable APIs are and potentially how flexible or not an API is. But it also can give you insight to have conversations with stakeholders about where there is gaps in your ecosystem. So stakeholders building APIs out that are new because existing ones don't give them everything they need. And sometimes that's just through education of how they can use existing APIs to fulfill that need versus extending those APIs to meet that need. So these are all good insights to be able to dive into that kind of detail. And you can dashboard this in lots of different ways once you've got the data in place. Similarly, as I mentioned, you might want to break it down by business domain. Depending on how you define your API ecosystem, you can define the domains to align to what your organization does and the data that they consume within your organization. And then you can dive into that data from those different perspectives and get an insight of alignment between APIs and the products that they fulfill and the services they fulfill. So really, it gives you a way of modeling that in different ways and then obviously determine how reusable that ultimately is. So in this example, we have average rating of assets. Well, it's at 0 because at this point in time, no one's rated those assets. So we want to kind of get people to feedback on how reusable they are and see if we can get that number up so that we know we're getting value out of our ecosystem. And these are all things that the C4E can then start leaning into to start deriving value for. So why are we doing this? Well, we want to get insight for different domains and different stakeholders as to how their APIs are being consumed and give them access to this kind of insight. But we can also get a view of enterprise versus domain-specific assets and also common assets. And the amount of reuse can then inform what we do with the platform and also how we evolve the products on that platform. So another good example is, using KPIs for governance and quality improvement. And in my experience, this is one of the high order bits around what metrics accelerator and using metrics to help improve that virtuous circle for a C4E can really give you value in. You ultimately want to get your products, the APIs you're building to be as high quality as possible and being as predictable and reliable as possible. And you want them to be really usable assets. They are a currency in your organization that should have high value. And the way to improve that value is to make sure that there's quality behind it. So when you set out your C4E and you set out standards and practices and principles and other things that ultimately find their way into your life cycle for an API, you want to be able to measure that and then feed that back into that process so that these things continuously improve. And one way of doing that is to use some of the metrics to identify where you have gaps in those things and improve your DevOps process accordingly. So you can measure things like, is there automated testing in place? Is there policies being applied? Is Exchange documentation there? Are all the facets of Exchange being applied, like categories and tags and other things that you define as necessary? You can use these insights to start to educate and inform stakeholders to do these things and then start to automate them in your DevOps process. So it's a bit of a carrot and stick type of balancing act. And this can really help improve quality and delivery. And a lot of it aligns to non-functional requirements like security and reliability. You're helping improve the quality of these APIs and your products. So these insights can give you that value over time as you start to bake them into your delivery model. Another good example is API trending. So a really good measure is how many APIs are being deployed per day, how many are being built per day, test outcomes, other things. You measure measuring these things on a daily basis can really provide insight as to how well the ecosystem is moving forward. Another really good example is platform capacity monitoring. So again, what are you trying to measure here? Well, one example is how much of the platform is being used in terms of vCores and other measures around capacity. Where is it being utilized? Where are my limits starting to be reached in different environments? This can be really useful when you've got multiple business groups in your organization with vehicles allocated to those business groups, and you can measure across the enterprise as well as across those business groups when they're starting to head towards their capacity limits and what they can do about that. And that can inform whether the good design choices are being made, but also whether their growth demands that they have more resource allocated. If you're in an organization where you have a cost recovery model around API consumption and usage on the platform or things like that, KPIs like this can help provide insight into the best way to recover that cost, but also to help educate and inform stakeholders about how to use the platform better. So these are more passive measures that help you understand where the platform is being used and what's actually happening. And the final one, which, in my experience is incredibly valuable, is things like defect management. Not just in developing your APIs during the life cycle, development, testing, SIT, UAT, those types of things, but also when you get to productionizing your APIs. If you ultimately have baked into your logging framework some kind of defect management and logging and reporting, getting those insights into what defects are happening and how those are triggered to incidents by real stakeholders, if you've automated around that, you can certainly bring that back into your analytics to improve the quality of your ecosystem and all your processes around it. But even if those are not automated into something like ServiceNow, even if users raise tickets and they tie them down to a particular integration, that data can be really useful to feed back into your analytics to improve your C4E and therefore improve your DevOps and other things. So metrics like this are really, really important to do alongside your C4E to help measure value. And to give an example of how these types of insights and C4E structures can help improve reliability, just as an example, once you've got some structure in place and you're measuring that, your velocity in terms of delivery can really accelerate quite fast. And what you're trying to do is achieve that velocity in a way that makes it sustainable and repeatable and reliable. Velocity for the sake of velocity ultimately will peter out and not really get the longer term gains that you want. But if over time you're building in these types of frameworks and insights, you can certainly improve the quality in a sustainable way. And then once you start to federate your C4E out into your organization, that becomes part of business as usual delivery in terms of building APIs and helping land them on the platform and deliver them and measure value from them. So you're trying to do these things in parallel in a very balanced way over time, and you don't want to try and do it all in one go. So how good can it really be? Well, on a recent project where we did something very, very similar to this, by just having good insights and good constructs, we were able to improve discovery of our APIs by 44%. We helped reduce delivery errors, and we hardened down on our DevOps by introducing the right policy enforcements during build and test deployments by a massive 60%. Which is amazing, but we didn't do that on day one. We did that, several sprints into delivery once we developed some insights. But it helped improve what we needed to harden down on, and then how we best did that. So we didn't want to slow down our developers, but we certainly wanted to make sure we were starting to bring those measures in and, with the right standards behind them. We increased reusability by 30%, which is not as high as we wanted, but we were certainly aiming to improve it over time. And just by having good insights, we were able to make sure that people understood how to find their assets and what they could consume from those assets on MuleSoft. And finally, overall, we're able to accelerate delivery by 65% over a period of several sprints. And as I said, we weren't trying to do that exponentially. There's a limit as to what you can do, but the goal was to make sure that each of the spoke teams ultimately could have a sustainable velocity that worked best for that part of the business, with predictability behind it and the insights to be able to track that. So that's the end of the presentation. I'd welcome any additional questions on any of the presentation now.
So community, now is the time. If you have any other questions, please pop them in the chat. We have one more from Ed about how big is your ecosystem? How many, the number of interfaces and the number of APIs?
Good question. Well, we're a consultancy, so we don't have a big ecosystem that we run, but certainly some of our clients have had API ecosystems of upwards of 200 APIs in their ecosystem, which is quite a large amount. And they've had full-fledged C4Es. Other clients that we work with have certainly had ones that are a lot lower than that, so 50 to 60. But certainly the C4E models that they had are certainly reflective of what they needed their C4E to be at that particular point in time. And I think that's one of the key points is you do need to understand what does good look like for your C4E at certain points in time. You don't want to roll everything into it at once because not everyone will be able to absorb it and consume it at a certain pace. But you do want to have a view of where you're going. So yeah, I would argue that once you get beyond a certain number of APIs and a certain number of stakeholders in your organization, a C4E starts to add a lot of value just to give it predictability. Got a question here from Vera. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. Are all the numbers on the final slide coming purely from the metrics framework provided data? No, they're not. They're coming from other things that we measured on a particular program. So we were measuring things like velocity in Jira. We're using some of the dashboards in Jira, for example, to get some of those measures. We're also measuring some of the project planning metrics that we had in as well. So some of them are from the metric accelerator and some of them are not. So we were measuring the outcome of the overall project that we applied this to. Another question from Ed. What packing policy do you need most? Need 1 resource per app, 5 resource per app? Good question. So I think you're talking about, are you taking a domain-driven design approach to your API deployments in terms of how many APIs do you put in each deployment application? I think that's a measure of the design strategy that you're taking. If you're taking a purely microservices-based approach, ultimately the right answer is you want 1 per deployed application, but that can be very expensive in Cloud Hub, as you know. Ultimately, you want to try and achieve a middle ground, which is a domain-driven design approach where like-minded APIs that kind of relate to each other, like customers or orders, are co-located in the same API deployable, but you potentially scale them vertically when you need to and break them out into their own deployables when you need to scale horizontally. There's no hard and fast rule to that model. It depends on what you're trying to do with your strategy and how you're measuring capacity and things like that. But these metrics can give you insight into when that's necessary. Oh, do you use most? Okay, thanks, Ed. Thanks for clarifying that. So that's just to answer that question, Ed. Sorry, and I'll come to C2 in a minute. The approach I use the most is a domain-driven design approach upfront. So I'm talking to a customer at the moment, for example, where they're not sure what strategy works best. So we're starting to define their integration catalog, and then we're mapping that into the different domains, and we're going to come up with an application network that supports that, and then we're going to see what capacity we need for that. And we're taking a domain-driven approach as a starting point because we think their growth over time and the capacity they'll have on the platform and the cost they want to spend, those things in balance are best met by taking that type of strategy up front. But it doesn't stop us at some point in that journey breaking things out and doing more of a microservices-based delivery model as well. So that's kind of where we're starting. And that's the one I tend to see the most because customers sometimes are cost-centric and they're very new to MuleSoft, so you need to take them on that journey in a logical way. So C2, your question on how big is the team size of C4E that you've seen? The typical team size I would probably see in a C4E would be 4 to 5 people. including a platform owner. So normally a platform owner, an architect, maybe an API designer, and maybe a tester who helps support testing, automation, and different spokes. I would normally see those types of resources as a minimum. And they are responsible for developing the standards and other things in C4E and working with the different spokes. And in the spoke team, I would typically see 1 to 2 developers and maybe a tester if they're really agile, who develops all the test cases as well. I would see that type of resource model in the most part as being fairly typical. And then you form that community of practice between those different stakeholders. And the best model I've seen is where we had different API developers float in and out of the spoke teams from time to time and come back into the C4E and help develop some of the standards and then go back out to the spoke. And they would do that on a fairly regular basis. And you got that virtuous circle of improvement. That's the best model I've seen. C2's got a question around, could you in theory apply the same principles and processes for any other platform, e.g. for non-MuleSoft platform, but with similar competencies? Yes, I guess you could. I've certainly developed COE, C4E type models with other platform technologies. I think, though, what makes it the most successful with MuleSoft is the fact that MuleSoft is very oriented towards an API delivery model, more so than other traditional ESB integration platforms ever will be or ever have been. And so having the technology that gives you the tooling and the speed of delivery to achieve your C4E outcomes, makes for a great partnership. So if the tooling doesn't support what you're trying to do as from a C4E point of view, you'll have to do it in other ways. I worked recently with a customer who's using a non-MuleSoft platform, trying to do something similar, and there's lots of gaps in that platform that they're having to write customizations to do, like automation of policy enforcements and things like that to check that the code is right. And they're spending a lot of time on that, right? And really where you want to spend the time is building product, building APIs. So if the tooling doesn't support that, you'll end up with a higher cost of ownership and therefore spending more time trying to support your C4E rather than the other way around, where the C4E is helping drive delivery. So there are advantages to having that marriage between the tooling and your C4E model that you set up. Sung Kong, I hope I pronounced your name correctly. It's got a question. What particular Mule features or upcoming features are Slalom and your clients most excited about? And do you see any challenges or ease of adoption within the C4E? So to answer the first question, we're most excited about RPA and automation, and universal API management in particular. A lot of our customers have existing ecosystems with APIs built on a number of different platforms, and some of them have MuleSoft and some don't. And often the conversations that we have with them around how they can do more with MuleSoft, but at a more flexible way, is around that universal API management. So for example, I have one customer who has 600 APIs in their global ecosystem, some of which are on MuleSoft and some of which are on legacy IBM products, I'll just say. I won't say which product, but one of the things I'm working with a customer on is developing an API strategy where universal API management for MuleSoft can help them govern and get insight into all of their API assets, regardless of where they're deployed. And they're really excited about that because they want to be able to develop that insight without having to do a lot of plumbing into MuleSoft to do it through proxies and other constructs. So we're really excited about that because that's going to be able to help us bring MuleSoft value into a much larger set of customers, and also showcase the value of why MuleSoft can help solve a lot of integration and connectivity challenges for those customers. So it will help evangelize usage of the platform and solve lots of pain points for customers, which is really important. So we're really excited about that. And do I see any challenges or ease of adoption within a C4E? I guess you mean that question generally in terms of what kind of challenges do we see in getting it adopted in organizations. Probably the couple of challenges that I see the most in C4E adoption is, one is having clear ownership on the customer side in terms of who owns the platform and who owns that vision for integration and API delivery in that organization. Is it one person? Is it many? Are they clear about what they're trying to achieve in terms of business outcomes? And it's really important to find that person and be able to get conversations happening with that person, because the C4E is going to be helping them enable towards that change. So really what we want to try and do is win the hearts and minds of that person. And then also second to that is the stakeholders that are going to be the customers of the platform. I see a lot of challenges around different stakeholders in the business about what value a C4E adds. And so we take them on that journey to win the hearts and minds about how it creates reusability and how it drives delivery and accelerates value and reduces cost of ownership over time. And these metrics and insights can give them a lot of value and insight into how that's possible and how they can then measure that. And they can see it in real time, and that's really valuable to a lot of customers. So they're probably the two that I see the most. Do we have any final questions? Oh, I've got another one here. How do you measure C4E success time to time, reusability, number of users, error reduction, anything else? Well, as I said, the KPIs that I shared in the presentation now are certainly not the full set of things that you can measure. I guess, how do you measure C4E success? I think in many ways through things like that if the C4E is playing a role in helping accelerate delivery and you're being able to measure that in different parts of the business, and the C4E is helping provide the capabilities to do that, you can create measures around that, as I mentioned, through the fact that things are going out to market quicker and you've got speed of delivery. Those things won't happen without some kind of structured approach to delivery, of which a C4E gives you. So you definitely want to kind of tie those things back to what the C4E is doing in terms of capabilities, templates, delivery models, etc., that you're building out. So some of the KPIs I mentioned are just some of those things. I think it's different for every business. At Slalom, we have a full set of KPIs that we've identified that many customers want in their API ecosystem, a lot of which are very MuleSoft centric and some of which are agnostic, are things that we know customers care a lot about. And we evaluate those on a customer basis to identify what's best for that customer. So every customer will ultimately be different and every organization will be different. Any other questions? That was a really good question. Thank you.
Okay, Steve, it seems that we don't have more questions. So first of all, I wanted to thank you for making this great session. And above all, not only the preparation, but the way that you're answering the questions from the community. It's always very, very helpful and well received, as it's something that in the recording, they won't have the chance to. So it always makes sense to join the live events, right? And community, if you can please say thank you to Steve in the chat, it will help us passing back that feedback for the community team as well. If it has been a helpful session, if you learned something new. Yeah, you can see them coming still. Yeah, excellent. Love it.
Yeah, thank you for allowing me the time to present. It's C4E and analytics and bringing those two things really passionate about, because I think we've all done lots of MuleSoft projects, and I think it's really satisfying to be able to show customers the value that you get from that. And at Slalom, we're really looking to do that for all our customers, as early as possible. And I think that it's really challenging to do that for a lot of customers. They often don't want to spend the time, so you want to find ways to really accelerate that and do that quickly. And we develop methodologies and ways of doing that, using things like Metric Accelerator to help achieve that outcome. But if anyone's got any additional questions, I mean, my contact details are in the presentation. more than happy to answer any questions offline as well in the community that people might have. So thank you for inviting me to present. I really appreciate it.
Of course, Steve. We'd love to have you here. Now, Steve, I think we're going to move on to the competition then. That is 4 questions around C4E. 2 of them are directly based in the presentation. I took the creativity to take 2 questions from there. And we're going to move on to that event, if that is all right. Let's start the screen here. We will need you all to please, as always, let me copy the link here so it's easier for you. You just need to click on that link and you will start appearing. Now, the competition today is for training vouchers. You will compete on 4 questions. You have to be the best. You have to be the fastest. And the winner takes it all is the training vouchers that can help you for the level 2 certification. We'll wait a couple of minutes until we have a bit more people in. Excellent. We're going to wait 5 seconds. There you go, 2 more, 2 more. Let's wait 5 seconds more. Wow, that's a lot of people incoming. We're 36 though. Okay. Actually, let's stop the recording at this point.